Well, you heard the calls for heads to roll over the Levy affair, but no one saw this one coming. The government has sensationally sacked the parliamentary committee that oversees the Crime and Misconduct Commission. The charge? That it was biased in its investigation of the CMC chairman, Ken Levy, with some committee members calling for him to resign even before the hearings were over. But the committee chairwoman, Liz Cunningham, says it's hard to see how Dr Levy won't be joining them on the sidelines. She joined me in the studio earlier today. Liz Cunningham, should Ken Levy stand down as acting chair of the CMC?
That is a decision for Ken Levy to make. Sadly or regrettably, the evidence isn't looking good in terms of his credibility.
I've been reading through the transcripts of the hearings that have been released. There seem to be a number of inconsistencies. Number one, on November the 1st, he's asked at your committee hearing if there's been any contact from anyone in the government prior to his opinion piece appearing in the Courier Mail. He replies no, but that was wrong, wasn't it?
Yeah, and the inaccuracy wasn't wholesomely or fulsomely corrected. On the 4th of November, he wrote to me as chair, but to the committee, saying, look, it was brought to my attention on the afternoon of the 1st, that there had actually been media unit to media unit contact. So he said my error was that I'd forgotten about that. It had been mentioned to me, but it was just media unit.
Made it seem like an incidental contact between two media units.
That's right, without any direct involvement himself. As time transpired, that has proven to be quite inaccurate. OK, so he's been incorrect on November the 1st, he's incorrect on November the 4th. November the 13th, there's another of your committee hearings, and Ken Levy reveals he not only forgot the phone call from Lee Anderson to the media unit, he forgot a series of phone calls between himself and Lee Anderson and a face-to-face meeting in Lee Anderson's office. Do you believe someone in his position would forget that series of events? The facts that have been presented and tabled in the evidence of Mr Anderson, a reasonable person would find it very difficult to accept that a man in Dr Levy's position would forget. It's not just an incidental phone call. Under questioning, Dr Levy acknowledged that he had rung Lee Anderson. He didn't volunteer this information. Under questioning, he acknowledged that he had rung Lee Anderson seeking an appropriate journalist to sit down and discuss the article. Further on in the evidence, Mr Anderson said Dr Levy called Mr Anderson and said, I'm in the vicinity, can I drop in for a chat? Mr Anderson said yes, and Dr Levy proceeded to level 15 in the executive building and sat in a meeting room with Mr Anderson and chatted for a period of time. Mr Anderson's description of that meeting was prepping for the article and for the potential questions that Des Houghton could ask him. I find it difficult that a man in that position would forget all of that.
So he had three options, November the 1st, November the 4th, November the 13th, to mention that face-to-face meeting, and he didn't. Only after Lee Anderson's transcript becomes publicly available, he reveals it to his letter to Parliament yesterday.
That's right. And even then, it's a cursory acknowledgement that it happened.
If I could just go backwards a step, because you mentioned there was repeated questioning. Initially, he said he came up with the name of the journalist that he wanted to speak to at the Courier Mail, Des Houghton. He was asked how that came about, and he says, if one Googles criminal motorcycle gangs and the Courier Mail, those two search terms, right back to 2007, the only name that comes up is Des Houghton. Now, I've tried that at my computer today, and I found a number of other journalists and stories under those search terms that he would most probably have found. Has the committee examined that discrepancy?
We haven't looked in detail at all of the discrepancies. We've referred the matter to the Ethics Committee, noting that there were sufficient discrepancies to hit, we believe, the threshold for an Ethics Committee hearing.
And then Lee Anderson, in his testimony, contradicts Dr Levy on who came up with the name Des Houghton, doesn't he?
That's right.
So would you say there are multiple errors, multiple inconsistencies?
There are.
So is that why, in the response to a question yesterday on whether he lied, you said, based on the evidence that we've received, it's hard to argue that he didn't?
Yes.
So do you think this is befitting of a person who sits in judgment on the integrity of others?
I think if I was sitting before a person who'd been in this situation, it would be difficult to have confidence in his objectivity.
The CMC, of course, has those Star Chamber hearings where it's not acceptable for people to say they don't remember and they don't recall.
Mm. And when a person's appearing before a parliamentary committee, there is an obligation under standing orders and the criminal code to tell the truth, not to decide what information we should have, but to tell the truth and allow the parliamentary committee members, irrespective of what committee it is, for the committee members to determine the appropriateness or the value of that information in context and how it informs the further deliberations of the committee. Dr. Levy failed to be fulsome in his responses to the committee. He failed to be truthful in his corrective correspondence with the committee, and a man in his position should know better.
In a letter to Parliament last night that we've talked about, he says, and he complains about the conduct of yourself and others on the committee, saying he wasn't given the courtesy of being able to respond to all of these allegations and that the committee was aggressive and partisan.
There was some aggressive questioning that was done, and anyone that sees the tape of the 1st of November meeting would know that. And the Leader of the Opposition made a point on a couple of occasions of saying that she was asking questions as Leader of the Opposition. Having said that, Dr. Levy had every opportunity he wished to take to correct the record. He'd shown that he was prepared to do it by letter on the 4th of November. He had the opportunity in the Parliament, in the committee hearing on the 13th of November. He had any opportunity he wanted in writing up until I tabled those transcripts, and he didn't do it.
Regardless, the government believes that your committee is biased and has sacked the committee. How do you feel about being sacked as the chair of that committee?
Oh, nobody likes to be sacked, but I'm more concerned about what it's done to the committee system in total. The PCMC is a committee that oversights the CMC, but every other committee, the Ethics Committee and all the portfolio committees, are purported to be independent committees of the Parliament, acting effectively as an upper house because of our unicameral system. The message that the sacking of the PCMC is giving, not only to those committees but to the community, is unless you act in a way that is acceptable to the government, you are a candidate to be sacked.
OK, Liz Cunningham, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.